So, David, as we get started, can you just tell us a little bit about your journey into ministry? Give us a little bit of your backstory.
Yeah, I been in ministry for about 20 years now, various roles within the local church and associate roles. Started off like a lot of us did in youth ministry, led some worship, feels like forever ago, former
Mm-hmm.
version of myself. And then two church plants and in Charlotte, North Carolina, and now traveling full time, teaching and speaking and writing, and loving the different journey that we've been on. And some of the journey was the most formative for me, and I talk about it in the book, was when we moved our church plant from a very affluent part of uptown Charlotte, our downtown area, to the dividing line between the rich and the poor in our city. And I tell you, Tony, that moment, which was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, it just changed my life. And started to really explore the dynamic across racial and economic lines within our church. And that's where we're at now, is doing that full time and trying to help others navigate that.
So let's dive into that. I mean, that's a pretty significant move. Maybe begin
Yeah.
with what was the conviction that you started to feel that move was necessary for your church, and maybe what did that process look like?
Yeah, honestly, I would love to say that I was some brilliant leader that walked into an opportunity to explore these things, but really it was just, I stood up to preach one day, in the opening salvo of chapter 1 of my book. It just starts with a scene of me saying, "Oh my, we all look alike." And we had planted this church, and everything was word of mouth, and it was strong and healthy and generous, and I mean, it was just like my favorite church ever, and it still is. I mean, I love Center City Church, and but about 5 years into it, I just looked up one day, and I think that the Holy Spirit just really opened my eyes to, we had this call to a metropolitan city with diversity in economics, race, religion, thought, all of these different types of diversity. Yet our word of mouth strategy led to homogeneity. And I think that's when I started to ask questions. And what I did is I actually went to some other leaders in town who had really diverse churches. And I just said, "Hey, can you just teach me? Can you teach me? How did this work? What are some of the challenges?" And that led to some moments in prayer, that I was invited into some moments of prayer between two Black pastors and two white pastors in town. And it just kind of grew from there. And then all of a sudden, out of that prayer time, somebody came to me and said, "Hey, there's an opportunity. We're renovating a 40,000 square foot warehouse. We'd love for your church to anchor that." And so we ended up moving on that opportunity to create basically like a really life-giving community center that had a healthcare clinic and various different ways to engage with entrepreneurialism in a community. But it was right on the line between the rich and the poor. There was a addiction recovery place in there, and a missions organization that did a bunch of work locally and abroad. And so we just kind of jumped on an opportunity, but it was the relationships from that opportunity that started to really change my heart and perspective, because we were also hosting 100 kids every day after school from one of the higher poverty areas in our city. And seeing those kids every day and the brilliance of who they are, it just sparked something in my heart. I just finished up a master's degree program doing ministerial or organizational leadership, excuse me. And I just decided to keep going, do my doctorate, and I studied generational poverty and why families who are born into poverty stay in poverty. And that's where it started. It literally started in prayer, and then relationships, and seeing that the disparities in our community had nothing to do with the capacity or the brilliance of my new neighbors. It had everything to do with the societal challenges that have been around for generations.
Yeah. Speaking of that, maybe I read it in your book. I think it's only 3% of people born in poverty actually actually move out of poverty at some point? Am I just pulling that number out of thin air, or
Yeah,
do I
no, no,
remember?
no, no, no. That's actually really good. I mean, when I teach on this stuff, I talk quite a bit about when was the last time you let the stats and demographics of your city break your heart, right? And so, for me, it was when Harvard and UC Berkeley did a study on upward mobility, which means where are you born and then where are you going to end up in your life. And the stat for Charlotte was 4%. So
Okay.
4%. And people, when I teach them this stuff, and across the country in different parts of the world, people are like, well, I'm glad my city's not like that. And I'm like, well, the overall stats are only a few percentage points different. So
Right.
what you're referring to is that if a child is born into poverty, they have somewhere around a 5% chance, depending on the city, of ever breaking that cycle of poverty and reaching the upper levels of income. And if you just turn that around, that means that these kids have a 95% chance. And Tony, what I'm saying about like the relationships with these kids that I was forming, seeing them every day, they were no different than my own kids who had, my kids are teenagers now, but I was like, man, Jack and Brian are really similar. Except for my son Jack is growing up and his daddy's doing a doctorate, has some relationships, and I was sitting on the board of a university, and you could kind of see his path. And Brian had never really left the neighborhood. So there's challenges there. And then there was also challenges with like, okay, now people are starting to come to the church and we've got these racial dynamics going on within the church. My preaching, my teaching, my leadership style, my leadership team, my board, did not represent the community that we are also trying to pastor as well. And so there was a lot of different dynamics at play, and made a lot of mistakes. But ultimately, I feel like God really used this to help shape my heart in a more holistic way.
So I have a feeling I know what the answer to this question is going to be, but just kind of as a follow-up, what I've noticed in working with churches is, when God gives a pastor, a ministry, kind of a picture of what the future is going to look like. Oftentimes the pastor, first of all, gets that conviction before anybody else in the church does.
Yeah.
And then there's usually a process to help the rest of the church kind of get to that same place before they move forward in this direction that God's taking the ministry. But what I've noticed in every other instance, maybe you're the exception, is that even when there's this strong conviction and a strong sense and generally agreement, this is the next step God's calling us to take. Not everybody goes. Not everybody follows through with that. And so the question is, did you lose any people as you relocated?
We lost. So you have to remember, we were going from one of the like vibiest parts of the city, like super cool, hipster joints in the city, to the dividing line where it went from that type of vibe directly across the street from us was $500,000 homes and up, way up from that. And then on the other side of the street was pervasive poverty, highest crime rate in the city, consistent violent crime. And so when I announced that we were making this move, and you have to remember, we're going from being a church plant set up, tear down, to a permanent facility that was like, we're pitching this as like a beacon of light to the city. There's nothing like it in the city, right? And 25% of our church left and never came back after the announcement. And then we were miraculously raising money out of this group of people and people all around us. And I mean, just miracle after miracle. That was just like God's provision to get us into this building. And instead of that ramping up like most churches do when they're moving into a new season, a new church, a new, facility, we had lost 50% of our people by then. I think if I were self-aware, which I try to be, and I've had a lot of reflection on this time, I think that I moved too fast from when the Lord was breaking my heart. You got to remember, I was in my mid 30s at that time, excited. I'm in my 40s now, and a little bit more wise, and been punched in the teeth a few times. I look back on it, and I could have done better, much better, at the slow road of teaching and training moving into that, and the why behind the move, but I did not anticipate the deep-seated implicit biases in my heart and in the heart of others. And I mean, it was so heartbreaking, man. It was like, I'm not sending my kids to church with those kids. We're not going to church on that side of town. You know, and we got to remember we're a church plant. So like, they were like, the kids ministry was meeting in a hallway of an elementary school at this point. And we had like these beautiful, safe, secure facilities that we had now, you know, so it didn't have anything to do with the building. It had everything to do with, you know, we were uncovering some parts of our heart. And then, you know, right when we moved into the building, we had a police related death that made national news. Keith Lamont Scott was killed very close to where we were at. And then, you know, I don't know if people remember this, but Charlotte, there was, you know, protests all in the streets and some rioting and stuff like that. And so that it was all happening while we were moving our church. And it took, honestly, man, it took a few years to build back and then to surpass where we were at. And, you know, I just went back and visited last weekend. I've stepped down about 2.5 years ago from pastoring that church. And now I'm in a season of traveling full time, but we went back this weekend, and it's like a meeting of the United Nations with more unity. And it's just absolutely beautiful. So yeah, we lost a lot, but we also gained a lot. So from what we were learning.
Well, and let's begin there. I don't want you to reveal your entire journey, because I want to encourage people to read the book Neighborliness. But you described this dichotomy that existed between your community. I mean, right across the street, these two very distinctive communities. How did you begin to engage this journey then of trying to minister to both sides of the street?
Well, yeah, we hosted that prayer meeting. We started to host it in our church. Every good thing that has come in the last 7 years out of this journey traces back to prayer. We started to invite other ministers, nonprofit leaders. Very regular for us to have 30, 35 leaders on Wednesday afternoons at noon, just praying together. And out of those prayers came relationships. Out of those relationships came ideas on how to engage the community. You know, out of that prayer time came an organization called Freedom Communities that I had the joy of, kind of based on some of my doctoral work and doctoral studies and how the church can respond to generational poverty. We launched an organization that's doing great work helping families engage in areas of education, employment, healthcare, housing. And so we started to host the neighborhood meeting from Camp Green, which was just like the association meeting of this historically high poverty community. And I just ran PowerPoint and sat in the back and just, you know, hosted all these people talking about their neighborhood. And out of that, some coalitions started to build. And we started to we did a 6-week series for the neighborhood on Tuesday nights, where I reached out to a local historian and I said, can you tell the story of this neighborhood? And so we had local leaders and local experts on, you know, the history of that neighborhood and the surrounding areas. We taught about gentrification, and we taught about, you know, some of the good, bad, and the ugly of what had happened to make that neighborhood the way that, you know, it had come to a lower economic area. And so we just really started to have like this community minded, it's really where the message of neighborliness came out of, which, you know, I define neighborliness as embodying the presence of Jesus to the world around us. And I think that Jesus took a lot of care and interest and concern with others across various lines. And really, that's just, we didn't do it perfectly, Tony, but we did it sincerely. And it just came out of prayer and relationships and coming up with ideas to try and help the neighbors know that we're not just there to be another predominantly white church that came into town, that, you know, came into their neighborhood and was trying to change a bunch of stuff. We kind of took the posture of, we want to learn about your neighborhood. And that's the sanitized version of it. There was a lot of ups and downs, but, you know, I would say that taking an interest in the community, instead of thinking that we had the answers, we were trying to get the story of the neighborhood.
So as I'm hearing you talk about this, we just met. So
Yeah.
let me share a little bit about me. I mean, my natural wiring, I'm a problem solver.
Yeah.
And especially when I'm experiencing something or seeing something that is just feeling that conviction that you alluded to, especially around issues of racial and economic injustices. And I'm just thinking, we need to do something about this. And so as I'm listening to you talk, and after reading your book, gosh, I just kind of thought, I'm wondering if my natural wiring, my natural let's fix this mindset may actually be causing more harm than good around big challenges like this in our society. What's your reaction to that?
I think that leaders, you and I, and the folks that would be, joining us later to be a part of this conversation, you get to that point because of some sort of natural inclination, some sort of instinct, like we all know that feeling, right? You just have a gut feeling and it seems to work. And then you string a few of those together, and your instincts for leaders that can read people and read situation and read teams and read culture get you pretty far. But what I've realized over the past several years is that instincts are a combination of lived experience and knowledge. You start to put that together, and now all of a sudden your lived experience and your knowledge, you go, you know what? It's like a developer looking at a neighborhood and saying, that's going to be a good one because they saw it 10 years ago happen in another place and it popped, and millions of dollars later. But if you think about the fact that when you're trying to connect across dividing lines, if you don't have lived experience of relationship across dividing lines, and if you haven't taken a humble posture to just learn and take the long road of learning about cultural inequality, the formed opinions that we have may not actually be formed on anything other than opinions from other people that raised us or our own perspective and our life experience. And so I think that our instincts can be wrong. And I think that we have to be really careful about that because, the way that we engage a high poverty community as opposed to a middle class or upper class community, a lot of times you're not even speaking the same language because there's so many cultural things that have happened. There's generational trauma, there's experiences. Most of the kids that we interact with in high poverty communities know somebody that has been shot or killed, or they have experienced it in their own life or family, or at least have heard about it at school. Now, that's not the way that a lot of us were raised, where it's like you might see that on the news, but there's trauma. And if we don't know how to deal with in a loving, in an engaging way, people who have walked through trauma, it just doesn't make sense. And so I just think that it's a combination of lived experience and knowledge. And I would just encourage, like what I always tell people, it can be very overwhelming. And all of us, I'm an 8 on the Enneagram, so I want to run towards problems. I want to fix stuff, right? As I've grown in my knowledge and in my understanding and in my relationships with folks that live in different communities than I grew up in, now my instincts are a little bit better. I'm more patient. I'm going to listen more than I'm going to speak. I'm going to try and deflect leadership opportunities and say, hey, actually, this person over here is probably the one that wants to be, let's spotlight them, or, bring somebody else to the forefront. Or, even right now we're in the midst of starting our 5th organization in the last 10 years. It's called the Neighborliness Center, focusing on research and policy advocacy and designing frameworks for churches, pastors, business leaders to engage in matters of justice. I know that I'm better at starting organizations now than I was then because I've got 4 other organizations that we've started. So it's just no different than all the other ways that we build our instincts. I just think that because we may be good with people, we think that we're good with all people, and that's not always true.
Yeah. Well, let's take this a step further and speak to Christians more broadly, and the church too, specifically, the broader church.
Yeah.
Well, first, let me start here. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's still plenty of evil in the world, and you only need to, make a few clicks on Facebook or Twitter to find it, or just turn on the nightly news, and it's very evident. There's still evil in the world, but I really believe people who are following Jesus, they've committed their life to Christ. For the most part, people that call themselves Christ followers, they see the injustice in the world and they want to overcome that because it's a part of the transformation God's making in our lives. And when we see the need in our world for people to have relationship with Jesus, and then through that to help overcome some of these injustices, I think most Christians want to be a part of the solution in big challenges like this. But I'm reading your book, and it's just striking me. I've been a part of and worked with so many churches that have gone into communities like West Charlotte, and with the intention of helping. And sometimes I'm wondering if we're actually creating more problems. And so there's got to be a better way, I think, for churches to engage in communities like West Charlotte. So can you give us a picture of what that could look like?
Yeah, I mean, I really think that it starts with prayer and relationships first and foremost. Many times, especially, and I have a lot of big church background, so this is not it's an informed indictment. Okay, so just like in the sense of like I've been there, right? We used to go into high poverty communities, and it was always this. I didn't mean it at the time, but it was, we are going to bring you something. We're going to bring you something from the suburbs, or we're going to bring you something from, the more affluent areas to fix your neighborhood. And, I tell this story all the time, and it creates cognitive dissonance where it's like, Tony, how many times have you ever seen a bunch of African-American teenagers go into a gated, predominantly white community to clean up their neighborhood with no reason, no relationship, to walk door to door and say, could I do your yard work? Or nobody that's listening to this is going to have a story about that. I don't think, but it's so common for predominantly white churches to show up unannounced in communities. And, I tell some of the stories in a chapter called Toxic Charity. Shout out to Bob Lupton, my friend, who wrote a book called Toxic Charity. And, I just tell the story of many times people are going into neighborhoods without permission or request, thinking that they're helping, but they're helping in a way that they think that they're helping. And so I would say that the way that I encourage people in the book to, I'm not saying don't serve. I'm not saying don't do I speak to the idea of these 1 week of service initiatives that churches do, and 15,000 hours of service and celebrated on the news and stuff like that. But largely, I would just ask churches and pastors, are you in relationship with the people that you're trying to serve? Do you have an informed or do you have a directive from anybody in the neighborhood? What needs to happen in the neighborhood? Or are we just saying we're going to go clean up that dirty part of town? Or are we just saying, we're going to come bring a solution in there? And one of the biggest fears that folks had when we started even doing our redevelopment work in West Charlotte was, because we've been heavily involved in like the affordable housing space and that type of stuff, was, if you bring too much development over here, our taxes are going to go up and we're going to end up having to leave. You're just a part of the problem. And so we've had to really work hard hand in hand with the neighbors, saying, okay, what do you want? What do you love about this area? What do you never want to see changed? If you did have some help from another part of town, what would that help look like? And it looked a lot like renovating parks and using the influence of others in the community to say, hey, they never come around here and update our parks. We're we've got a merry-go-round still. Those things are death traps. Who use merry-go-rounds anymore? Stuff like that. And the more that you have little wins that show that you're listening to the neighbors and listening to the longtime pastors and residents of the community and the nonprofit leaders, the more that you'll start to gain credibility. And I just think that we need to listen more to the people that have been living there a long time. It's their neighborhood.
And that really does speak to the overarching theme that I picked up as I read your book, more about, again, my natural, and I think this is all coming from a good place for these churches too, is they want to help, they want to make a difference. But the overarching theme is we need to start with relationship building first, and let those neighborhoods actually speak to how we can help, rather than us kind of forcing our solutions on their neighborhood. Let me finish our conversation here, David, though, with this. You actually wrote this, so I want to make sure this is what you articulated. Okay. And then you can apologize for it or explain it on the other side. You wrote, our current church culture needs an awakening. We need to clearly understand that all believers have been called to fulfill the greatest commandment of loving God and loving our neighbors. So especially after these last couple of years, I'm guessing most pastors would agree with that statement. They would acknowledge that an awakening is needed. So maybe talk specifically to pastors right now or other church leaders. How would you encourage them if they're sensing that as well?
Yeah, I would say, like, really simply take the next right step. So do like an audit of your own life. How much are my instincts formed by my personal relationships and experience with people across dividing lines, and then my knowledge. Like, look at your bookshelf. I encourage pastors, can you look at your bookshelves and see women and people of color theologians? They're out there and they are brilliant. But most pastors that I know are quoting lots of old dead guys that are white. And there's nothing wrong with the older white guys. I've gained a lot from that. It's just when I started to intentionally look for, Willie James Jennings says that our theological imagination needs to be shaped. And we're shaped by who we read and who's pouring into us. And so I would just say for pastors, take the next right step. If you're one of those pastors that hasn't really engaged much, and that was me, 7 or 8 years ago, that was me. Start with, I hope Neighborliness could be that book. I mean, I wrote it from that perspective of like really trying to engage somebody in the conversation, not like smash them over the head with like what's wrong, but like, let's engage, use it as a conversation. I would encourage pastors, if you've never really done a sermon series on it, like we have a ton of resources at neighborliness.com for sermon series, small groups, and it doesn't have to be my book. There's so many other good ones out there. It's just but I would say engage in a season of learning before you're teaching on it. Engage in a season of relationships, because we always want to like teach immediately, but there's some depth that the Lord is trying to get to. And then, the last thing that I would say is that like, if in the last 2 years, there's been an awakening worldwide, that we're in a bit of a lull right now, if I'm being completely honest. People aren't talking about this topic very much. But if you have learned a lot in the last 2 years, if you have engaged, now start to engage some of those instincts. So what have you learned about engaging your community? What have you learned? So that's, a lot of what I do right now is help pastors imagine, what does justice look like in my church and in my city, And so I'll work with executive teams on that. And what does it look like for me to build a team within my church that focuses on justice, so I'm not the only one that always has to talk about it, right? And so like that's another thing that we do, is like help pastors build a team that's really exploring this stuff, because it's in these moments where culture isn't thinking about it. If you are learning and growing right now, God forbid, I never want it to happen ever again, but if we have another situation like the multiple that have happened in the last couple of years, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, you're going to be ready, because you've taken the time in the quiet, and it's still raging, but not a lot of people are talking about it right now. I would just say, maybe just take the next right step. And so there might be some people that are ready to engage with other churches in citywide transformation, and get into the housing stuff or get into the healthcare stuff. And that's more 401 or master's or doctorate level. But some of the churches are ready for that type of stuff. And there's plenty of folks out there, myself included, that work with churches to know how to really strategically shape programming for the benefit of all their neighbors.